All right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to lecture 3.1. We are now almost officially halfway through the summer session, so congratulations on making it this far. We're going to move on now to the topic of the rationality of voting, and this lecture is the introductory lecture to this unit. So in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about some general views that are out there about why we vote. And then in the next lecture, we'll turn to the first paper assigned in this unit. Okay, so I wanted to start with a brief transitional note. So we just finished with the Nevsky paper, and as you saw, she had a very interesting proposal about collective impact cases. So she tried to convince us that sometimes when a morally significant outcome depends on the actions of many people, we can be able to help, in her technical sense, even when we are not able to make a difference, where that also has a kind of technical meaning. And she told us being able to help is sufficient for having a reason to act. So electoral outcomes seem to be the kind of outcomes that fall into this category. So it matters morally who wins elections, but as individuals, we usually cannot make a difference to who wins. At least that's true in the kinds of elections that most of us take part in this country, though there may be a number of, say, local elections where this is not the case, where we can make a difference. Okay, but regardless, you might think that Nevsky's view is simply all we need to explain why we should vote. So the answer might just be that we should vote because we can help the best candidate win, even if we can't make a difference to whether they win. And Guerrero is going to give us another take on this issue in the paper we'll read for the second lecture of the day. He's going to show us that there's actually a lot more to say, and that even if we found Nevsky's proposal satisfying in some ways, there's still more to say about this issue. So as we move forward, I would like you to just keep in mind or have as a question in your mind whether or not Guerrero and Nevsky's arguments are compatible. I'm not going to say what I think about this right now, but it's worthwhile for you to bear this question in mind as we move along. All right, so let's talk about some different views that a person might have on why they vote. So suppose that you live in a democratic society. Supposing this is true for you, what reasons do you have to vote, assuming you can vote? What is the goal of your voting? So here is one theory. One theory might be that you vote because you want to influence the election's outcome. This is a very intuitive view. We're going to call accounts like these outcome accounts, and an outcome account of the rationality of voting just says that we vote to change or influence the outcome of the election. And the traditional version of this view says that the relevant outcome is who wins. So we might have an election with these three candidates, and this might be me, and I care especially about this guy not winning. Although the images don't represent the badness of either of these two, perhaps somebody else also isn't a good candidate, and so I want this person to win. And suppose that my goal in voting is to make this guy win. That's a very intuitive view of what we do when we vote, and we're going to call views that say we vote to influence the outcome of an election an outcome account. What's another view one could have? Well, here's another theory. Maybe I vote because I want to influence the mandate the winner of the election receives. So we'll call views like this mandate accounts. And a mandate account just says that we vote to influence the degree or maybe kind of political authority that elected candidates enjoy. And you will have seen, if you've already read the Guerrero paper, that Guerrero's view is a version of this kind of a view. Now, a caveat here is that Guerrero makes a big deal out of saying that the mandate a candidate receives is actually part of the election's outcome. So he thinks there are two aspects of an election's outcome: who wins, and then the mandate that the winning candidate receives. And so he wants to call his view a kind of an outcome account. Whether or not we want to say that outcome accounts include mandate accounts or not doesn't matter here. I'm going to keep these two kinds of accounts separate for now, but just know that one could categorize things in different ways. The important thing is that if you believe you're voting because you're trying to influence the mandate of the winner of the election, that's a particular kind of reason you could have for voting. And so that could rationalize your voting in a certain kind of way. Okay, so there's another view one might have, which is that we vote to express ourselves. So maybe when I vote, I want to express or show my commitment to my political party and my political values. And we're going to call these kinds of accounts expressivist accounts. So these accounts say that we vote as an act of expression. So maybe we're expressing our support for our favored political party, or maybe we're expressing our support for what's aligned with our own political values and priorities. One could flesh out the content of what you're expressing differently, depending on your view. Um, if this seems a little mysterious to you, what this notion of expression is, you might think about as a loose analogy the expressivist account of voting as drawing an analogy between, say, wearing a jersey of a particular sports team to express your support for a team or to show that you identify with the team. The idea here is that when I suppose I'm wearing a Cardinals jersey because I'm from St. Louis, when I wear the Cardinals jersey and say I go to a game wearing the jersey, I don't really think that my wearing the jersey is going to actually help them win. But I still wear the jersey because I want to express my support for the team, and I want to show that I identify with the team, and so on. So too, the expressivist account of voting says you don't necessarily vote in order to influence the outcome of the election. You vote in order to express yourself. Let's call this, whoops, did I have two theory three? Sorry, this should be theory four. A fourth theory is that I vote perhaps because it's my civic duty to vote. So we're going to call this general category of account duty-based accounts. And a duty-based account says that we vote to fulfill some kind of an obligation. And there are, of course, many different ways of specifying the particular duty or obligation that voting fulfills. So I'll just give you a few examples. Maybe the obligation that we fulfill when we vote is the duty to do our share in the democratic process. So here the idea is that we don't want to be free riders in the process that produces good government. We couldn't have good government without a process of voting. And it's being a free rider if you don't vote in this process and let others do all of this work for you. So maybe this is what explains a duty to vote. Another view might be that we have a duty to vote because we have a duty to avoid being complicit in injustice. So we need to vote against what is causing injustice and for what promotes justice. And if we fail to vote, we fail to fulfill these duties to promote justice and to avoid complicity in injustice. Here's one more view. Maybe you have a duty to vote simply because you have a duty to exercise civic virtue. So it might be an exercise of civic virtue to write letters to your Congress members, to participate in demonstrations, and also perhaps voting is one of the civic duties. And if you have duties to exercise civic virtue, then this might also explain why you have a duty to vote. So those are three different ways in which you might flesh out the content of what the duty to vote is. Okay, now, so those are four general kinds of views one might have about the rationality of voting and why we vote. And it's very natural to wonder whether maybe more than one of these views could be correct. And I take it that they could. It seems to me that these views in themselves, at least fleshed out in a certain way, don't exclude one another. we might vote for many different reasons, and it may be overdetermined that it's rational to vote. So maybe I vote to express myself. That's in fact one kind of reason I really have for voting. But maybe I also have a civic duty to vote. And maybe I also vote to strengthen the mandate of the elected candidate if it's my candidate. It's possible for these views to overlap. And I think, in fact, that Guerrero even considers in his paper whether the presence of many different reasons to vote might actually undermine his view. And he has something to say about this, so stay tuned. Um, Regardless of your view here, though, suppose so, even if you think that these different accounts of why we vote are compatible with one another, if you think that influencing the outcome of voting of an election is one of the reasons that we have to vote, then you're going to have to reckon with this problem, which is the apparent insignificance of our individual votes to the election's outcome. So it's a possibility that you could flesh out the four different views I've just reviewed in a way that makes them actually intended to exclude one another. It seems to me that you could also allow that the views should be fleshed out so that we might have more than one reason to vote. The reasons will be mutually compatible. But even if you go that second route, that more inclusive route, if you think that part of the reason we vote is to influence the outcome of the election, then you have to deal with the problem that it seems like we don't actually have an influence on the election's outcome, given our insignificance with respect to just the massive number of voters overall. So this is to say that even if we want to take an inclusive approach to the four theories of voting just reviewed, we still need to pay attention to a paper like Guerrero's. Okay, and just before we move on to the next lecture, I would like to briefly note a few questions about voting and the ethics of voting that we won't be talking about in this unit, but if you're interested in voting, there are a lot of really interesting resources out there on these questions, so do be in touch if you'd like to know more about any of these issues. So one question that we might be interested in, but again, we're not talking about in this unit, is whether or not you have an obligation to vote in a particular way if you vote. Another question is whether or not you have an obligation to educate yourself about the issues before you go vote. You might also want to know what explains the wrongness of voter suppression. So I think we all would be inclined to agree that voter suppression is wrong, but that's not to say that we're totally clear on why it's wrong, what makes it wrong. So that might be a question you have. Similarly, we might want to know what's wrong about vote buying. There's literature on this too. There are interesting questions about who should have the right to vote. So, should felons have the right to vote? How young? How young can you be and still have the right to vote? All sorts of questions of this sort are also dealt with in the literature. And also, I think a lot of us probably have been thinking about the Electoral College system, certainly recently and maybe for a long time. So you might want to know, is the Electoral College system just, and how would we figure out whether it's just? What account of voting justice would give us an answer to that question? So like I said, these are all questions that one could ask about the voting and the ethics of voting, and we won't be discussing these here, although I think on reflection that Guerrero, his view has some implications for this first question. So if you find that an interesting question, you might keep that in the back of your mind as you think about Guerrero this week. Okay, that is it for this introductory lecture. I will see you momentarily in lecture 3.2.